Hi, I'm going to talk a little bit about whole foods versus processed foods and sort of what are the differences and what do I need to be concerned about when I'm consuming a processed food, and then also why do they add all these additives and why do they carbonate wrong some of the things, and why can't they just leave a product, process it as is, and stop doing all this pasteurization and all these other things to it. So, the biggest concern that food industry has, not only is it its profit margins, but also its existence. Um, the general idea is that you want to keep your customers around as long as possible. Um, if you don't, and if you're killing them, um, generally, that's kind of bad for profits. So now this is a little bit questionable because there's two coins, or two sides of the same coin. In this instance, there's the short term and the long term. Companies focus much more massively on the short term because why? There is a lot more evidence, and it's easier to do research on and proven research at least to a degree, much more significant than long term. Short term, someone eats this product and then they get sick. Well, is that reproducible? Yes, it keeps happening. Okay, so maybe we won't serve that product. But if 10, 20 years down the line, all of a sudden people are getting cancer, it's hard to say. There's a lot more variables added in, like how much do they consume the product, what are the differences between the consumption rate, where they live, and like what are really the commonalities between those people who are dying for some reason, who are theorized to consume more of your product. So it becomes a lot more sort of guess science, or sort of scientific guessing, hypothesizing than in the short term. So, a little off topic there, but now what we'll say is most of the additives and things that are being added to foods is to increase shelf life or to limit microbial growth. Why do you want to increase shelf life? Well, for a product to be feasible on a global scale, you're going to need to be concerned about when your product spoils. Not only for the safety of your customer, because you want a bunch of people consuming spoiled product, but also in the realm of profitability. If your product goes bad on the shelf within 3 days, but that means that your product has to be flying off the shelf. It has to, literally, people have to see it and buy it instantaneously. There can't really be much of a lull at all, which makes it really difficult to make a product. And in order for to increase profits or to make a product much more feasible, you increase the shelf life of it. So, especially when you're first introducing something like a health drink or something like that, it takes a while to catch on. It's difficult to make sure that it is in all the right places. There's a bunch of people, or a bunch of different people making protein or energy or sort of fruit drinks or something like that, and to sort of separate yourself is really difficult. So you have to increase your shelf life. The other part of that is that if you look up things like Listeria, Salmonella, E. coli, Campylobacter, those are things that you don't hear about anymore. I mean, you do in some cases, but most of the sort of health gurus out there and advocates are all focused on the negative aspect of processed foods, and that they're degrading nutrients and they don't have the sort of fresh qualities of food. Well, and in fact, actually, a lot of frozen food has higher quality or more abundant nutrients than fresh food, so that's something to be concerned about if you're consuming it in a grocery store setting. If you just pick it off off a plant and you eat it, then obviously that has more nutrients. But so yeah, those are all things you need to research more. Campylobacter, Listeria. Despite the best efforts of the food industry, and sometimes not best efforts, American Peanut Corporation of America screwed up that really big. Despite the best efforts of the general food system, we still have instances of these horrible microorganisms ravaging bodies. Personally, I don't want to get sick every time I consume a product. And if you were to try and make like a vegetable drink with all your fresh greens and tomatoes, and it was all this great healthy nutritional drink, and that had all these antioxidants in it, then you are far more likely to get something like Salmonella or E. coli in this. Fresh fruits and or fresh leafy greens and are much lower to the ground, and fecal matter and from like water runoff of farms that are close to each other, from like pig farms or something like that, can come right in and seep into your lettuce or your kale, and have really long-lasting effects on, or detrimental effects on, the amount of salmonella within your fruit drink now. So, and one of the ways that we realize that is that we don't live in a perfect world, and the food industry recognizes that. And so, ideally, you don't have any E. coli or any salmonella in your farm. However, that is legitimately and statistically completely infeasible, especially at the scale at which they're being produced. And even especially in the instance of something like raw milk, you're so much more likely. You can't control a cow, where it goes, or when it poops, if it scrapes its udders in its own fecal matter. You can't control that, and so despite the best efforts of like even a small farm, you're still going to have to worry about exposure to microorganisms. So microorganisms are the biggest reason why the food industry adds sort of, or does pasteurization, has to add a certain amount of salt, which we all know has some negative effects towards our blood pressure, let's see here, some other additives, antioxidants. There's also mold inhibitors and things like that. Let's face it. Like I said, we don't live in a perfect world, and in order to feed the amount of people that our economic system is facing, we have to do these things in order to limit the amount of sicknesses and illnesses we get. If a bunch of people start dying from Listeria, or E. coli 017H7, or 01757. 01787. 01757. I forget. Uh, but if a bunch of people start dying from those microorganisms, we're going to have a much bigger issue than what we currently face. And don't get me wrong, it still doesn't justify adding a bunch of sugar to our foods, but there is some logic behind why can't we get the freshest of fresh, and why isn't the world perfect, essentially. It's because of these microorganisms, and it's because of the liabilities companies face against getting people sick from these things. Actually, the Peanut Corporation of America just shut down because of that. Actually, Sunland Foods actually just shut down because of that. The FDA has only recently, within the past 2 years, acquired the power to shut a company down. They didn't have that power yet. Why didn't they have that power? Well, some may say the food industry didn't allow them to have that, but also the funding for the FDA is extraordinarily limited, and that's and a lot of people say, well, why don't we have the FDA test every food product, and why isn't the FDA the sole tester of this? Because we don't have the funds. In order for the government to try and fund every single product that comes out, and also do that in a timely manner, it's not feasible. We can't incur all those costs. So then we put those, the FDA puts in place regulations in order to abide by these, and in order to limit and make sure that the criteria is met when doing analysis in-house, on your own bill. And so to make sure that if you don't follow these, and if you don't put these rules in place, that you're going to suffer some sort of consequence. And generally it would be fines, or you would be sued by the whoever incurred the cost of having listeria in your body, but you would never be able to shut them down technically. Now the FDA can, so that's a huge step forward in order to making sure our food system is the safest as possible. But hopefully that kind of gets the point across why processed food is just not necessarily the best for you, or not as comparable. Why we can't have fresh food. Essentially, that's what we're doing here. Is that we're comparing why we can't have fresh food. Processed food is actually good in the instances of something like frozen food, and also a lot of foods have been enriched with vitamins and minerals, and we don't have the deficiencies that we once had, back in the 1800s, and that's something to be not at least in some standpoint consider thanking the food industry for. Is that okay? You've eliminated a lot of deficiencies. Thank you, and that's good. You can't argue with that. They've increased the availability of so many more foods that we would otherwise not have, because it's just not logistically feasible to do it. Why don't we go to a farmer's market every day? It's because it's not right around the corner. It's not a corner store. It's not a Whole Foods. It's not a Stop and Shop, Shaw's, or Flying Pigs, or whatever you want to have it. Those companies know what works, and I will say that if everyone knew exactly how the food industry worked, I would say we'd be able to come up with a better system. But because of the limited knowledge of individuals on a global scale, or at least countrywide scale, um, we can't. It's not feasible to try and assume that consumers are going to go ahead and do everything perfectly as far as cooking their food and checking all of their grounds as far as making sure there's no mold on their product, or checking to see if there's no microtoxins in their product. Um, okay, I'm rambling, but yeah. Hopefully this gets across something good.